The member for Southern River.
Mr Speaker, I'm deeply honoured to address the Parliament on this day, November the 11th, Remembrance Day. On this day we remember the huge sacrifices that were made by so many during the wars that our nation has been involved in. We so easily forget the freedom, or that we take for granted the freedom that we have. We so easily forget the huge price that various generations have paid for the freedom that we enjoy. For example, of the 300,000 men that left the shores of this country to fight in World War I, some 60,000 never returned to be greeted by their families. Without the sacrifice of these men and those who followed them over the years, it's doubtful that we would have this great institution of parliamentary democracy in our land. And it's no exaggeration to say that West Australian soldiers have played a key role in many of the wars, and perhaps none more pivotal than the West Australian 10th Light Horse Brigade, which was part of the Australian Light Horse Brigades. Their so-called mad charge on October the 31st, 1917 against Beersheba, which was heavily defended by the Turkish forces, was a turning point in the Palestinian part of the First World War. It was actually at this time of the evening, around about 7 p.m. local time, that the Australian forces galloped into Beersheba. On entering Beersheba, they were able to secure the water supply for their horses, enabling them and their horses to push on ahead instead of perishing in the sands of the desert. Lest we forget. It is indeed a privilege, Mr Speaker, and honour to serve as the member for Southern River in this 38th Parliament of Western Australia. And I want to extend my congratulations to members on both sides of the Parliament who have taken their seats. The seat of Southern River, Mr Speaker, takes in some long-established suburbs, such as a small part of the suburb of Gosnells and Huntingdale, along with newer suburbs of Forest Lakes, Canning Vale, and now the rapidly developing area of Southern River. This electorate faces special infrastructure needs and transport needs. The planning for the area of Canning Vale and Southern River was based around the Mandurah railway line actually coming through Canning Vale, but the Labor government saw fit to not have the railway line come through that area. They saw fit to not provide this area with a rail service. The two major roads leading out of that suburb, or out of my electorate, towards the city are choked with traffic for over 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours at night. They're in desperate need of upgrading. One of the things that many electors said to me during the election campaign is, will you please fight for a railway station in Canning Vale? And I certainly will do that at every opportunity. Being a relatively young area, a new housing area, there is a great lack of community infrastructure. I think I may be the only member of any electorate that can say that his electorate does not have one public library. There is one currently under construction, thankfully. But there is, despite this lack of community infrastructure, there is a great sense of community and a wide cultural diversity, with people from many different ethnic backgrounds having made their home in this electorate. Mr Speaker, perhaps I'm one of the most reluctant members of this House. Reluctant in the sense that until 5 or 6 years ago, I had never dreamt or even thought of the possibility of entering Parliament. For the last 25 years, I've had the pleasure and found great fulfilment in pastoring churches. In that role, I had the privilege of being with people in the high points of their lives, things like weddings, anniversaries, celebrations of births, but also walking with people in the valleys of their lives, in times of serious illness, of being with people when they lose loved ones in death. And I've many, many times had the privilege of sitting with people on their deathbed, holding their hands as life ebbed away, and then conducting their funerals and supporting their families. I've had the opportunity to assist parents in teaching their children a Christian world and life view, which gave them a dependable framework for navigating the uncharted waters of life. My work with the Dandenong Palliative Care Service in Victoria in the 1980s taught me that ultimately life is about relationships. Never once did any one of those many people on whose deathbed I sat with them and spoke with them, never once did anybody say, I wish I'd built a bigger house, or I wish I'd earned more money, or I wish that I had more shares, or for that matter, I wish I'd been a member of Parliament. Their regrets, their joys, always focused around family and relationships. And as this chamber considers various legislation, you can be assured that I will take a very keen interest in how a particular piece of legislation will affect families and communities. Our state will only be as strong as its communities, and its communities will only be as strong as its families. As a student of history and having worked with families in many different settings, I'm convinced that the quality of the relationships in our families and community ultimately determines the health and the strength of the fabric of our society. Mr. Speaker, I joined the Liberal Party I think it was 5 years ago, at the urging of some close friends who knew me well and who shared my deep concern about various pieces of legislation which were coming before Parliament. Legislation which was beginning to reshape our society into one which increasingly made the weak and the vulnerable dispensable. I mentioned abortion and euthanasia, the attempts to legalise prostitution and so legitimise the sexual abuse of women. Increasingly, the freedoms and the protections that we have known in this land are being eroded by the propositions put forward by the so-called political correctness movement. A defining moment for me was some years ago when I was serving on the staff selection panel of the local Christian school, when a young lady who had been working in a child care centre and had applied for this position, and I asked her the question, why do you want to leave the child care centre and work in a Christian school? And she's told us that in the child care centre that she worked in, she was required to make special mention of the Chinese New Year, to Muslim Ramadan, the Jewish Day of Atonement, but any reference to Christmas and Easter was strictly forbidden. In fact, she said that Christmas carols, they were not allowed to teach them to the children. They were not allowed to, at around Christmas time, even have background music of Christmas carols. And at that time, there was also a push on from various political quarters to take away the exemption that Christian schools have to employ exclusively Christian teachers. So, Mr. Speaker, I was persuaded to nominate for pre-selection, and I guess the rest is history. But let me add that without the generous support of my family, many of whom are here this evening, and friends who are also in the gallery, and members of the Liberal Party, I would not be here today. A special word of thanks is due to my son David, who took time out from running his businesses to act as my more or less full-time campaign coordinator and did a sterling job. Thank you, David. I also want to publicly record my sincere thanks to the more than 70 volunteers who involved themselves in my campaign, and to those who contributed financially, and to those who helped on polling day. Two other people that I wish to mention by name: my wife Jenny, who's there in the gallery, Jenny, who's stood beside me now for the last 33 years as my wife, and who during the campaign put up with me leaving home at 5:30 every morning and often not returning before 11 or 11:30, sometimes midnight. Also want to thank my brother Eric, Senator Eric Abetz from Tasmania. He knew that I was pretty raw in the whole thing of politics and untried, and he came over in the first week of the campaign and he said, I'll teach you a thing or two, and he certainly did. He taught me some very useful tricks of the trade, and I believe that some of those tricks which he taught me, which I would never have thought of using, actually helped me get over the line in Southern River. And he also phoned me quite regularly during the campaign just to encourage me to make sure that I wasn't losing focus. Mr. Speaker, as I enter this Parliament, I do so conscious of the great opportunities that Australia has given me. I first set foot on Australian soil in March 1961 at Fremantle, as my parents were on their way with their 6 children to starting a new life in Tasmania. You may find it hard to believe today that in those days, as an 8-year-old, I couldn't speak one word of English. Perhaps I know too much English now. Mr. Speaker, having come to this country with my parents from Germany, I can say that throughout the world, there are many people who love what we have. That is why so many people seek to come to the shores of our country. The current influx of South African migrants, with whom I've had the privilege of working with, and some who are in the gallery this evening, bear testimony to the fact that this country has a tremendous amount to offer. We all like this house that we call Australia. It's a great house. It's a house that gives its citizens great opportunities and much protection, and also opportunities for prosperity. As one of 6 children in a migrant family, I was able to pursue university studies and graduated with an honours degree in agricultural science. And I'm a fan of organic growing, so that might be of interest to the previous speaker. 4 of my siblings also completed university degrees. And as my brother Eric, as I mentioned, he has served in the federal parliament as a senator for a number of years. Australia is one of those very rare countries where with effort and ability, one can go a long way towards fulfilling one's life's dreams. Now, Western Australia is part of that house that we call Australia. But every house needs a foundation. And the more solid the foundation, the longer that building will last. And I believe that our forefathers laid a very strong foundation based on Judeo-Christian values. They built a foundation from which we still benefit today. But this foundation is being increasingly undermined and eroded. The values which have underpinned our society and its great institutions are under increasing attack by those who want to reshape our society. And the society that's being shaped is not a pretty one. We only need to look at the increasing violence and antisocial behaviour in our communities. When I was growing up, people used to leave their back doors unlocked. And I'm not that old. Throughout my primary school years, I can never recall anyone in my class having their home burgled. No one in the circles that I moved in ever had their car stolen. Teachers being attacked by students was just unthinkable. During the election campaign, I personally door-knocked around about 1,500 homes. And from the feedback that I got, it was very clear that law and order was the number one issue on everybody's heart and mind. Everyone was keen to see more police on the road, and I endorse that. But as I said to my electors, that is addressing the consequence of a far deeper issue. We need to address the root cause as well, and that is to get back to instilling values into our children. And that needs to begin in the home. But in so many homes, there is little or no teaching of values. And so children grow up thinking that the world needs to revolve around them. I believe that we're actually reaping the harvest of an era when the educational fad was to have so-called value-free education. By having so-called value-free education, we were sending the message that values don't matter. Then there was the era of so-called values clarification, when teachers were not supposed to say anything was right or wrong. Their role was supposedly just to clarify for kids what values they were choosing to adopt. Too bad if the value was that graffiti is fun rather than that it's criminal damage. Thankfully, times have changed a little. More parents and schools are teaching values to guide the children's personal actions and teaching them personal responsibility to the community of which they're a part. I believe there's been so much emphasis on rights that people have lost sight of the fact that every right actually has a commensurate balance of responsibility. I'm delighted to see that several of the schools in my electorate are actively teaching values to their children or their students, that their teachers have abandoned the foolish notion of the 70s and 80s that education should be value-free. and indeed to encourage a focus on values. I've written to every school in my electorate and have offered to sponsor a Community Values Award in each school. One thing that I will bring to this chamber, Mr. Speaker, is a strong sense of justice and of right and wrong. Whether that was something that God endowed me with in my mother's womb, whether it was something that my parents and teachers instilled in me, I don't know. But I do know that already as a 4 or 5 year old, at one stage I took on a bunch of teenagers who were up to no good. Well, I can't actually remember the incident. My mother did tell me that I came off slightly second best. And the members of the chamber may be pleased to know that I have learned to choose my battles just a little more wisely since that time. But I can assure you that I find it impossible to stand idly by when I see others treated unfairly or unjustly. The many migrants and refugees that I've advocated for over the years can testify to the fact that the fire of justice burns very brightly and strongly within my heart. Since having been elected on September the 6th, I've been amazed at how many constituents are being forced to live with the consequences of poorly thought through decisions made by governments or bureaucrats, and the despair and powerlessness that generates within citizens. A case in point is the compensation issue related to the Bush Forever program, which is a big issue in my electorate. And I'll certainly be working hard for reform of the current system of compensation. Holding a degree in agricultural science, I hope to bring to this chamber a rational and analytical approach to any legislation that will come before it. My strong interest and my long involvement and experience with environmental issues, particularly sustainable farming, along with my experience of running a small business for a number of years, I'm sure will be a great asset. My strong interest in agriculture will also cause me to keep a close eye on the activities of Biosecurity Australia, which all too often has been willing to recommend that our disease-free status should be sacrificed on the altar of free trade. But at the same time, Mr. Speaker, my pastor's heart will always be asking the question, what impact will this legislation have on families? What impact will this legislation have on the weak and the vulnerable? What impact will it have on individual freedoms? Will it help to build community or will it damage community? What impact will this legislation have on future generations? I see these questions as a practical outworking of my campaign slogan, which was putting people first, and that's something that I will seek to do at all times. Mr. Speaker, perhaps I could just ask at this point for a very short extension of time. Thank you. Being an ordained minister, some have asked me, how will your faith affect the way that you function as a parliamentarian? I'd like to answer that question for the benefit of all here tonight. I believe, in the first place, that every human being is made in the image of God and therefore is precious to Him. And therefore I believe that every human being must be treated with the absolute and utmost respect and with integrity and dignity. Mr. Speaker, I believe that future generations will judge this current generation on the way that we treat the weak and the vulnerable in our society. Furthermore, I believe that within the creation, God has also given us moral laws. Just like there's the law of gravity, and if you deny the reality of the law of gravity, it doesn't stop you from falling over or hurting yourself if you jump off a high-rise building. And I believe that if we ignore those moral laws, which are commonly known as the Judeo-Christian ethic, that any society that chooses to ignore that does so to its own detriment. And therefore I will be seeking to promote those values also in this chamber. I love the words of the prophet Micah, which he wrote some 700 years before the birth of Jesus Christ. He asks the question, what does the Lord require of you? And then he answers it and he says, to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. It's my prayer that I'll be able to do that throughout my term in this Parliament and indeed for the rest of my life. My pledge to this Parliament, to the electors of Southern River and to all those many people who assisted me and worked so hard during my campaign is simply this: I will continue to put people first. I will continue to be a strong advocate in this chamber for the values that have made our nation and state the envy of the world. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.